With our next panel following right behind Richard is talking about children first, African American kids and the child protection system and overall immigrant, including all black and brown children. It's our honor to have Judge Lange, founded an International Leadership Institute in 1994. Judge Lange served 4th Judicial District Court for the state of Minnesota, handling complex civil and criminal cases, and she's retired. She's also one of my dear friends, mentor. I look up to her. And also we have this amazing young activist, Kelis Houston, who I saw her on the news, and she's advocating for African American kids, and she's also pushing a huge legislative initiative about African American Children Act. Also, all the way St. Cloud, we have Farhiya Iman, who's a social worker on Stern County Child Protection. She has both bachelor's and master's in social work. Amazing. Thank you for coming all the way there. Would you please welcome all our 3 panelists?
My name is Farhiya Iman. I am from St. Cloud, which is about an hour away from here. I've lived there since I was 15 years old. I've lived there for a long time, and I've been a child protection social worker for about 5 years in Minnesota as well as in Arizona.
And my name is Kelis Houston. I'm child welfare advocate for African American families impacted by child protection, and now policy consultant as well.
My name is LaJune Lange. I'm a retired judge. I sat in the juvenile court and also was the co-vice chair of the racial bias in the courts task force that was started by the Supreme Court. And as you know, with anything involving racial bias, if the commitment is not there, then the biases still continue. And that's part of why we're here today. I'd like to start by telling you my experience as a trial court judge with cases of abuse and neglect. As you probably understand that I asked too many questions, I had too many expectations, and so my tenure in the court overseeing the family court cases was cut short. There is a system that needs to be decolonized in the courts involving children who are black and brown. We have a history in this country with a chattel slavery history where under white supremacy, black and brown children were looked at as objects and could be removed, could be sold, could be shuttled around with no accountability. That kind of attitude has filtered into the child protection system, and so you find an appalling lack of standards that continue. As a trial court judge, I believe in actually reading the file. So if I got a file from a child protection case, I'd want to read it before I came to court. Sometimes those files were like this. And I looked and I said, well, why is the file so big if the child has only been out of the home for 2 weeks? Well, the file begins with the birth of the mother or the grandmother and continued all generations to the present. So it was a weighting in giving a bias against the family instead of being considered on their present circumstances. It was telling the decider that this family had had a history of court involvement. We had one child brought to court, taken from her family, and I read the file, and this was a African immigrant child in the suburbs. And this child was taken by child protection from her mother because there was nothing in the refrigerator. There was no injury, no complaints that the child had missed any meals. It was a working parent who would bring home food when she came home, so she wasn't cooking and didn't have food in the refrigerator, but they had traumatized this child by calling the police, removing the child, and then her having to go to court to explain why she wasn't a horrible parent because there was nothing in the refrigerator. So I want the rest of the panel to be able to comment, but it is a situation where we had protections for African descendant children. Those protections were overturned by a judge, and in a case where a white family sought to adopt a black child. I had the unfortunate circumstance 18 years later of seeing that white family return that same black child to the court and say they wanted to terminate the relationship, emancipate the child, because now they were moving to Florida and didn't want to have any contact with the child. Again, a chattel. Just, we fight the black family, we're better, but now that he's 18 and we want to go on with our life, we don't want him anymore. We don't want him to contact us. And if you've ever seen anybody who looks forlorn, this child was just standing there totally paralyzed and astonished, listening to the only so-called parents he'd ever known saying they didn't want any contact with him. And they walked out the door.
Can I say something about that? That happens often where we'll have white adoptive parents when the child, the African-American child, becomes 13, 14 years old, now coming back to the courts to reverse the adoption, to voluntarily terminate their parental rights. LaTanya Robiecki has been in the news lately. She's a grandmother who's been fighting for the past 3 years, Chisago County, for her grandson. She was there since the child was born, but this white couple in Chisago County desires the baby, so the county has been blocking, and the appeals court as well. Now we just had a hearing, and they ruled in Chisago County's favor. But this white adoptive couple wants the baby, so the county is giving her grandson to this couple. They have no cultural context. When asked in their home, assessed for the appropriateness of it, when asked how they're going to keep this African-American child connected to his culture, they said, well, we take him to the YMCA and let him look at pictures of black people on the walls. And that was their answer. And I guarantee you, when he gets too big and too black, they're going to be back in the courts to give him back to the county. These kids have their names changed. We have 3 who weren't even adopted yet by the white couple, and their names were changed immediately. And they too attempted to fight the biological family for these kids. Luckily, and thank God, we won that case. But it happens more often than not. And these kids, because their names have been changed, and these are the only parents they've known, when they are returned to the system, they don't know who to reach out to, and they have no ties to their family to even reunify themselves, unfortunately. And they're told the lie that their family just couldn't get it together enough to reunify them or didn't want them, and that's absolutely not the truth. So what we're working to do through raising awareness and continue to talk about the issue is unveiling what's actually happening to black families, all families of African descent, quite frankly, within child protection. And the bill does work to protect all families of African descent. It's named African American because according to the state and counties, we're all African American, okay? Look at their data.
My experience is different. I mean, St. Cloud is a very small town, so the situations and experiences that we have is very different from the cities. And what I like the most about working in child protection is, as we all know, representation matters. And when I go meet with our families and they see that a black person, automatically, the trust is there, and I'm able to, talk with them, and also not have the biases that another Caucasian worker might have. I'm able to understand, our culture. I'm able to kind of reason with them. I'm able to understand why certain things are happening. And for me, it's a double-edged sword. I love what I do, but it's also hard I love what I do because I'm able to advocate for ourselves, and I'm able to kind of be in the room full of white people and say, this is not okay, this is not the way it works, this is not the way we should look at it, and be a person that advocates for ourselves. So for me, it is a double-edged sword in that sense.
I've seen a white female with her little blonde daughter and her little dark brown-haired adoptive or foster daughter come in a beauty salon. And the white woman says, shave off her head. She doesn't like the fuzzy hair of the girl. So the little blonde has her hair. The little brown girl now has a 1/4 inch. And they leave, and she's like a sheep that's been at the, the shear, because they don't want to touch it, don't want to deal with it.
Absolutely. I got started in this work not with the intention of doing policy or legislation. I just wanted to serve people. I didn't understand the issues that existed within child protection, but once I started to witness the trauma that children experience when separated from their families, I knew that I had to do something about it. With that situation, it's very rare that you'll have a social worker place a white child in an African American home. They think really hard about it, and it's typically the last resort. But with African American children, it's almost the state's preference to place black children in white foster homes, even if they want nothing to do with our actual culture, don't like our hair or our names or our skin complexions. There were so many youth that I saw in residential treatment that had been adopted by whites as youth, who now as teenagers hated their skin, hated being black, hated their hair, and were suicidal, quite frankly. Quite regularly in our residential treatment, that was the case. And that's not all children that are transracially adopted, but there's a lot of work that needs to happen before a black child should be placed ever in a white home.
In Olmsted County, if you're a foster parent, you get an allowance when you have a child brought into your home, a clothing allowance that allows you to buy up to 2 years' worth of clothes. So we have this kind of raising Isaiah effect where the government will pay a white family all this extra money to lay out all these clothes and give you toys and all these things so that you will feel that that is more valuable than being in your birth home. And so those kind of things are very fleeting. They don't make up for the nurture. They don't make up for the culture. And in the international community, there is a convention called the International Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the international convention that the rest of the world follows, sadly, the United States has not ratified it. Everyone else in the world has. But a child has a right to a culture, has a right to a family, has a right to an identity, and has a right to a relationship with both parents. And so this is not being followed in this country, even though by not ratifying it, we are telling the world that we already have these protections for our children. And so in many parts of the world, it would be totally, totally out of the question to remove a child from one cultural group and put the child in another cultural group. It would be just totally, totally a foreign concept, because people can trace their ancestry back thousands of years and would not consider a fungible relationship that a child could just be parked with another cultural group.
I'm not sure if you guys have the same struggles that we do, but we have very difficult time finding foster homes or families that want to be foster homes. A lot of times, in the county that I work for, the first priority is always to place the kid with the family, with a family member first, if not with a similar cultural background. Unfortunately, not a lot of people have the capability or are able to be foster parent. Therefore, we have very shortage of culturally competent foster homes. In that respect, then we're sort of forced to put them in the Caucasian family home because there's really no other option for them to go to.
We need to remove the barriers to kinship placement, period. What we have here are workers who don't know what the foster care licensing disqualifiers are, telling black relatives that they don't qualify for foster care when they actually do. Yes. We had a grandmother who for 3 years was told she didn't qualify for foster care licensing because of retail fraud on her record from 15 years ago. Thankfully, we were able to get an attorney assigned to her so that she can fight the adoption that was going to take place of her grandchildren to this white adoptive couple that wanted them. But we absolutely do have families, I think in the metro anyway, that would be willing to foster if those unnecessary systemic barriers were removed. I hesitate to ever tell a black family, couple, whoever, to do foster care because at times they're treated as worse as the biological parents. So it's kind of like a catch-22 for me. I know we need more foster homes, but to tell someone to subject themselves to that when it could risk their other children, I really hesitate. And I'm not going to go into the million stories that I have to say why I hesitate, but there's good reason. It's just a lot that comes with it. But in Minnesota, in the state, we have 12,000 white foster homes and 900 black foster homes. And that's not because we aren't willing to foster. I think the counties just need to do a better job of removing some of those barriers and engaging those communities.
But to do that, they would have to dismantle the existing systems of oppression that leads to disproportionate.
And that's why I don't even talk about it yet. I'm going to focus on the African American Family Preservation Act because I hear you. And I like to keep first things first. And I want to always focus on getting the kids back with relatives because they can't tell me out of both sides, maternal and paternal, that there's nobody fitting for this child to be with and nobody else in this child's life that loves them other than this white foster home. So anytime a kid is removed, my go-to is not let's find a foster home. It's what relatives are available that we can help stand up to get this child.
And the notification of relatives in Minnesota has been very inconsistent. So grandparents and others who live in other states who have children in Minnesota, they report not even being notified.
And they'll put a baby up for adoption and send the relatives this 30-day adoption notice, and they have the 30-day time frame to respond to that, and the judge won't even consider them if they haven't had a home study done yet. So let's just say you didn't know that your daughter was struggling in another state because she was trying to hide her involvement with CP, and all of a sudden you get notice that your grandchild is getting ready to be adopted out to strangers. Well, you show up and the judge is telling you, I'm not even going to consider you because you haven't had a home study. There's so much in the law that needs to change. I'm focusing on the African American Family Preservation Act first because I want to target the number of our kids that they're able to pull out of the homes and make sure that they're placing them with relatives when they do. But it's all those small things, too, that's leading to disproportionality. But, yeah, and it takes about 60 days to get a home study done if they rush it. So there's just no way for them to intervene once they're actually notified.
Yeah. I think that the grandparents have to know that they can request a home study because they won't even be told that they have that right. So they'll just be kind of strung along really outside the process.
And
then
show
they go
up if the county will talk to you. Because sometimes they sit in the court and the county ignores them.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the things that we want to do is get this legislation through, and if you would keep us notified through Fartun so that if we need to go to the legislature and if there's hearings and we need to see who's in favor and who's not, and call the roll on that.
Absolutely will. You all can sign up at preserveourfamilies.org or follow the Facebook page, the African American Family Preservation Act Facebook page. God is behind this movement. I've been doing this for about 6 years. Up until last year, I was by myself trying to push this legislation. But he sent me a solid team, thank God. And even with the so-called opposition that we've had, the bill is moving. We had a very promising meeting with DHS in several counties this week to go over the language and come to some sort of a compromise if we can. But it's moving. So reach out to your senators, reach out to your representatives, your commissioner, and let them know that you expect that they sign on in support of this bill. The black vote is powerful, and we don't talk a lot about local elections. It matters more than the presidential election, okay? This is an election year for us, and we're gonna have folks come into our community begging for our vote. Ask them how they stand and where they stand on issues that most impact our community. They shouldn't get it just because they show up talking that black stuff. How are you going to vote? What is your plan? What do you say about voter felon rights voting and child welfare disproportionality, things that impact the African American community? Minnesota is the second worst state in the country for racism. It is the second worst state in the country for black people to live in. It is apparent in the disparities. And if you don't believe me, just pull up the data. The data does not lie. So any legislation should really be getting at reducing disproportionality and inequity within these different systems. Otherwise, it's fluff, in my opinion.
You want to close out? Well, I want to commend you for being in St. Cloud. That's really, really tough work. So we want to thank our panel for coming and thank Mr. Wexler for his visit, and thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.